Somewhere in London, in the winter of 1882, a girl named Hannah woke up at 5 in the morning. Not because she wanted to, not because she had somewhere exciting to go, but because if the fireplace in the drawing room was not lit before the family came downstairs, she would be punished. Hannah was 14 years old. She had been taken from her family in the countryside and put into service in a wealthy London home. She had no days off, no privacy, no right to say no, and she was one of more than 1.5 million people in Victorian England living the exact same life. We know the Victorian era for its grand beauty, its ball gowns, its empire, its extraordinary wealth, the chandeliers, the dinner parties, the shining social world that history books love to stay with. But behind every grand door, behind every polished silver candlestick and perfectly pressed tablecloth, there was a person who was exhausted, invisible, and completely under the control of whoever owned the house they worked in. Tonight, we go behind those doors. We uncover the secret lives that Victorian society tried desperately to hide. And we hear the stories of the men and women who lived them, the ones who were never supposed to be remembered. This is the Gilded Trace. To understand what happened inside those grand Victorian mansions, you first have to understand who the servants were, and more importantly, how they got there. By 1881, the British census recorded more than 1.3 million domestic servants in England and Wales alone. The vast majority of them were women. Many of them were girls. The youngest recorded cases show children entering service as young as 10 years old. 10 years old. They came mostly from the countryside, mostly from farming families who simply could not afford to feed them. A daughter entering service meant one less mouth to feed, and if she was lucky, she would send money home if she was lucky. The process of entering service was dehumanizing from the very first moment. Young girls, some barely teenagers, were shown to possible employers at what were called register offices. These were basically employment agencies, but they worked with little oversight and enormous power over desperate young women. A girl would stand there. She would be looked up and down. She would be asked about her past experience, her health, her family background, and then she would be told whether she was acceptable. Ellen Buckton, a domestic servant who kept a diary in the 1860s, described her experience of being hired. She wrote that the mistress of the house walked around her twice without speaking, checked her teeth, asked if she had ever been sick, and then told her she would do, but that her hair would need to be cut shorter. She was 16 years old. Once hired, a servant's life was controlled by a strict hierarchy. At the very top of the servant world sat the butler, the highest-ranking male servant responsible for the wine cellar, the dining room, and managing the male staff. Below him was the housekeeper, a woman with great authority who managed the female servants and held the keys to every room in the house, literally. She wore them on a chain at her waist. Then came the cook, the lady's maid, the footman, the parlor maids, the housemaids, and the scullery maids. And at the very bottom of this world, so low that they barely seemed human in the eyes of those above them, was the scullery maid. Her job was to wash everything, every pot, every pan, every plate, every piece of cutlery used by a household that might entertain 30 guests for dinner, with cold water, lye soap, and cracked, bleeding hands. Her day began before anyone else woke up, and it ended long after everyone else had gone to sleep. Many of these girls had no idea what they were walking into when they entered service. They had been told it was respectable work, safe work, a chance to build a better life. What they found instead was something very different. Let us walk through a single day in the life of a Victorian housemaid. Not the perfect version you might find in a drawing room painting, the real version. 5 o'clock in the morning. The house is completely silent. The family upstairs will not wake up for another 3 hours, but the housemaid is already on her feet. She has dressed herself in the dark. There are no lights she is allowed to use in her own room. She pulls on her plain work dress, her apron, her cap, and she picks up her box of cleaning supplies. Her first task is the fireplaces. Every fireplace in the house must be cleaned of the ashes from the night before and set again with fresh coal before the family comes downstairs. In a large house, there might be 10 fireplaces or 15. Each one must be done on hands and knees. The ash is thick and hard to breathe. There are recorded accounts of servants developing serious lung problems from years of breathing it in, a fact their employers knew perfectly well and did not care about at all. By 7 o'clock, the fireplaces are done. Now the floors. Carpets beaten, floors swept and polished, stairs scrubbed on hands and knees with a small brush, one step at a time, working downward from the top of the house. Hannah Culwick, a maid-of-all-work who kept an extraordinary diary through the 1860s, described scrubbing the front steps of her employer's house every winter morning. The water would freeze on the stone before she finished. Her hands would crack and bleed. She was not given gloves. By 9 o'clock, the family was awake, and the servant became invisible. This was one of the most emotionally devastating parts of Victorian servant life, the deliberate invisibility forced on them by their employers. Servants were expected to move through the house like ghosts. If a family member appeared in a hallway, a servant had to press herself against the wall, look down, and wait until they had passed. In many households, there were special servant staircases, narrow, dark, completely separate from the main staircase, to make sure that the family never had to meet their staff except when they chose to. Out of sight, out of mind. Meals were another story altogether. The servants ate in the servants' hall, a separate room, usually in the basement. The food they were given was the food left over from the family's table, or cheaper cuts of meat instead. In some households, the quality of the servants' food was so poor that malnutrition was truly common. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, the most important Victorian guide to running a house, gave pages to calculating exactly how little food a servant needed to keep working. Function, not thrive. Function. And then there were the rules. The rules of a Victorian household were not suggestions. They were laws, and the punishments for breaking them were severe. No followers. This meant no romantic relationships of any kind. Any servant found to have a sweetheart, even just receiving a letter from one, could be dismissed at once without a reference. Without a reference, a servant could not find another job. Without another job, she had nothing. No going out without permission. A servant's free time, and what little there was of it, was completely controlled by the household. In many houses, a half-day off each week was considered generous. Some servants got less. No talking above a certain level, no singing, no laughter that carried beyond the servants' rooms, no using the front entrance of the house, ever. Sarah Seddon, a housemaid employed in Manchester in 1874, was dismissed for humming while she cleaned a bedroom. The mistress of the house heard her through the door and thought it was disrespectful. She was 20 years old. She had worked in that house for 4 years. She was gone by nightfall. By 10 o'clock at night, sometimes later, the last of the day's work was finally done. The dishes from dinner washed, the drawing room put back in order, the fires covered for the night, and the housemaid would climb back up those narrow stairs to her small, cold room and fall into bed. In 7 hours, she would do it all again. There is a word we connect with the modern world: surveillance, the constant watching of people's movements, communications, relationships, and behavior. We think of cameras, of technology, of algorithms that track every click and every keystroke. But Victorian servants knew surveillance deeply, long before any of that. They lived under it every single day. The housekeeper was the enforcer of this system. Armed with her keys, both real and symbolic, she had access to everything. She could enter a servant's bedroom at any time. She could inspect their belongings. She could read any letter that arrived for them before handing it over. And in many households, she regularly did all of these things. Letters between servants and their families were especially vulnerable. Employers defended reading them by saying that servants might be talking with undesirable people, meaning anyone outside the household who might encourage them to leave, or worse, might put ideas of independence into their minds. Elizabeth Banks, an American journalist who went undercover as a domestic servant in London in the 1890s, recorded her experience in shocking detail. She reported that her letters were routinely opened before they reached her. When she challenged her employer, she was told that it was simply how things were done, not in a cruel way, not with guilt, but as a simple statement of fact. Privacy in the modern sense simply did not exist for a Victorian servant. Their bedrooms, small, cold, often shared with other servants, could be entered at any time without warning or permission. Their belongings could be searched without explanation. Their conversations could be watched. And if anything was found that an employer thought was suspicious or improper, a letter, a photograph, a small gift from a family member, it could be taken away without appeal. The mental effect of this constant surveillance was deep. Servants learned to speak carefully, to move carefully, to feel carefully, to hide anything that mattered to them deep inside, because the moment it became visible, it became vulnerable. Anne Sherwood, a lady's maid in a wealthy London household in the 1870s, kept a secret journal hidden behind a loose brick in the wall of her bedroom. In it, she wrote about her fears, her loneliness, and her memories of the home she had left behind as a girl. She wrote, "I have learned to wear a face that feels nothing, the face they want, the face that does not trouble them. But inside, I am still here. I am still a person, even if they cannot see me, even if they cannot see me." The tragedy is that this was not accidental. The invisibility was deliberate. The surveillance was a tool of control, because a servant who was visible, who had relationships, emotions, ambitions of her own, was a servant who might leave. And leaving was the one act of freedom they had, which is exactly why their employers worked so hard to take it from them. There are parts of Victorian servant history that were never meant to be known, stories that were hidden, women who were silenced, cases that were buried under layers of respectability and social power, buried so completely that for generations the official history of the Victorian household barely admitted that anything had happened at all. But they survived in diaries, in court records, in newspaper archives that few people ever thought to search, and they tell a story that Victorian society desperately did not want told. Sexual abuse of female servants was widespread in Victorian England. I want to say that clearly, without soft words, because for too long it has been described in gentler language, called impropriety, called misconduct, called unfortunate incidents. It was abuse, systematic, widespread, and almost never punished. The legal position of a female servant in 19th century England was almost impossible to understand in how vulnerable it was. She lived in her employer's house. She depended on her employer for her food, her shelter, her pay, and most importantly, her reference. The reference was everything. Without it, she could not work. Without work, she had nothing, no savings to rely on, no family nearby in most cases, no safety net of any kind. This created a power relationship so extreme that resistance was, for many women, simply not possible. Not because they lacked bravery, but because the results of resistance were disastrous. And the people with the power to help them were the same people who had the most to lose by doing so. The case of Jane Wilbred became one of the most talked about servant cases of the 1870s. Jane was a housemaid employed in a prosperous Bristol household. When she became pregnant at 17, she was immediately dismissed without a reference. The father, her employer's son, faced no punishment at all, no dismissal, no social shame, no legal action. His life continued completely unchanged. Jane's attempt to bring a legal claim was dismissed. The magistrate said that she had put herself in a place of temptation by staying in the household. She was 17 years old, living in a house she could not leave, working for people she could not refuse, depending on them for every part of her survival. And the law's answer was to blame her. This was not an isolated case. The National Vigilance Association, founded in 1885, recorded hundreds of similar cases. Young women dismissed without references after becoming pregnant by male members of the households they served. Young women who had no legal help, no family nearby to turn to, no money to live on, nowhere to go except the one place that every Victorian working-class person feared more than anything else, the workhouse. That final humiliating place, that last resort where families were separated, where the old and sick were worked until they could work no more, where any last piece of dignity was stripped away at the door. It became the destination of women whose only crime had been to be powerless in the wrong house. But it was not only sexual abuse that haunted these households. Physical violence was also a recorded reality of servant life, and it was just as invisible to the law. Employers had enormous freedom in how they treated their domestic staff. Hitting a servant was technically illegal, but prosecutions were extremely rare. The social distance between a wealthy employer and a servant was so huge that complaints were almost never taken seriously, and a servant who complained risked something far worse than a blow. She risked her reference. She risked everything. Mary Ann Walkley was not a domestic servant in the usual sense. She was a dressmaker employed in a milliner's workshop. But her case, which shocked London in 1863, showed perfectly the attitude of the Victorian employing class toward the bodies of the people who worked for them. Mary Ann worked 26.5 hours straight, finishing a ball gown that was urgently needed for an aristocratic event. She was given no proper rest, no enough food. She collapsed from exhaustion. She was given a sofa to lie on in the overcrowded, badly ventilated workroom, shared with 15 other young women, 2 to a bed. She died 2 days later. She was 20 years old. Her employer attended the inquest and expressed regret that the death had caused, in her exact words, such an unpleasant sensation. An unpleasant sensation. Karl Marx wrote about Mary Ann Walkley's death in Das Kapital. He was outraged. He called it murder by overwork. The coroner returned a verdict of natural causes. These are not isolated stories. They are not rare exceptions that prove the rule. They are the pattern, the steady, recorded, historically proven pattern of what happened when human beings were stripped of rights, stripped of visibility, stripped of the legal and social protection that their employers took completely for granted. The women in these stories were not statistics. They were people with names and families and inner lives as rich and complex as anyone who ever walked through the front door of one of those grand Victorian houses. They were simply not treated that way. And yet, even inside this system of almost total control, even in the face of surveillance and poverty and legal abandonment, there were those who found ways to resist. Resistance in the world of Victorian service rarely looked like what we imagine when we picture someone fighting back. It was quieter than that, smaller, hidden in the edges of lives that were never supposed to matter, but no less powerful because of that. It looked like Hannah Culwick, that same maid who scrubbed frozen steps and bled in winter and wore her exhaustion like a second skin, secretly teaching herself to read and write, keeping her extraordinary diary hidden for decades, recording everything she witnessed and experienced with a precision and intelligence that her employers would never have believed she had, writing not with bitterness, but with a clear-eyed, steady honesty that has outlasted every single person who ever gave her orders. Today, her diaries are kept at Trinity College, Cambridge. They are considered one of the most important first-hand accounts of Victorian working-class life ever discovered. A maid of all work, invisible to her world, unforgettable in ours. It looked like the creation of the first domestic servants' unions in the late 19th century. Fragile, often suppressed, repeatedly laughed at by an employing class that considered the very idea of servant organization to be not just impractical, but ridiculous. Servants organizing, servants making demands. The idea was treated like a kind of social joke, but they organized anyway. In 1872, a group of female domestic servants in London met privately, secretly, to discuss their working conditions. They were discovered by their employers, and most of them lost their jobs within the week, dismissed, scattered, silenced, but others took their place and others after them. The idea, once it existed, could not be completely put out. It looked like women like Mrs. Lucy Luck, born in the workhouse in 1848, placed into service at the age of 9, who worked her way through the servant hierarchy with a determination that the system was never designed to allow. She saved, she planned, she eventually gathered enough to open her own small business and step outside the world that had shaped her whole childhood and youth. She wrote her life story in 1900. She was not angry in the way you might expect after a life like hers. She was matter-of-fact, precise. She described what happened to her and the people around her with a clarity that is, in the end, more crushing than rage. "We were not considered people," she wrote. "We were considered positions. And when the position was no longer needed, neither were we. We were not considered people. The Victorian servant system did not collapse overnight. It slowly wore away across decades, pulled apart by forces the employing class had not expected and could not control. The First World War gave working-class women access to factory work for the first time. The wages were better. The conditions were hard, but the hours were fixed. And most importantly, you came home at the end of the day. You had a life outside of work. When the war ended, the women who had tasted that life did not hurry back into service. Some did, many had no choice, but the numbers began to fall, and they kept falling. Rising wages in other industries pulled more women away. Education became more available. Opportunities, limited still, and still often unfair, but real, began to open in other directions, and a generation of women who had seen another way of living looked at the idea of returning to a servant's life and quietly, firmly chose something different. By 1951, the number of domestic servants in Britain had fallen from more than 1 million to fewer than 100,000. The grand houses still stand, but they are museums now, carefully preserved, beautifully lit, filled with visitors who wander through the drawing rooms and the ballrooms and admire the furniture and the portraits and the silver, and if those visitors are paying attention, if they look past the velvet ropes and the gilt frames, they might find their way to the back of the house, to the narrow servants' staircase, steep and dark, and barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. To the basement kitchen, enormous and cold, where the range burned all day and the scullery maid's hands were never quite dry. To the small attic rooms, low-ceilinged, simply furnished, where the people who made all of that grandeur possible came at the end of their 16-hour days and finally, briefly, were alone. Those rooms are quieter than the rest of the house. They always were. History has a habit of remembering the people in the portraits, the families in the drawing rooms, the names carved above the doors, the men and women whose wealth and power and social standing made them, in the eyes of their world, worth preserving. But every portrait has a frame, and every frame was polished by someone who woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, worked until midnight, and was never once asked their name by the family they served. Hannah, Ellen, Anne, Sarah, Mary Ann, Jane, Lucy, they did not choose the lives they were given, but they lived them with a quiet endurance, and in some cases, a quiet defiance that deserves infinitely more than the silence history offered them. The grand Victorian mansions of England were not built by the families whose names they carry. They were maintained day after day, year after year, by people who moved through them like ghosts, who pressed themselves against walls when their employers passed, who hid their feelings behind careful faces, who wrote their truths in secret journals tucked behind loose bricks, because the truth was the one thing that could not be taken from them as long as no one knew it existed. The least we can do, the very least, is read it. This has been The Gilded Trace, and tonight we remembered them. Thank you for watching until the very end. It means everything to us and to the stories we tell here. If this documentary moved you, if it made you think or made you angry or made you see the Victorian era differently than you did before, please leave a comment below. Tell me which story stayed with you. I read every single one, and if you want more hidden histories, more forgotten voices, more of the lives that the history books left out, subscribe for more. New documentaries every week. The next one you will not want to miss. Until then.